The winter of 1831 settled across the Piedmont region of North Carolina with an unusual severity, frost covering the tobacco fields in crystalline sheets that glittered under the pale morning sun. In the slave quarters of Fairmont Plantation, just outside Greensboro, workers huddled close to inadequate fires and spoke in voices barely above whispers about the massive figure who had arrived 3 months earlier. A man so tall that the doorframe of the largest cabin had to be rebuilt to accommodate him. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another transaction in the endless commerce of human flesh that sustained North Carolina's agricultural economy. This was a purchase that would haunt the buyer for the rest of his life. A decision that seemed prudent in the moment but would reveal itself as a catastrophic miscalculation that exposed vulnerabilities the planter class preferred to keep hidden. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 18 months would become a cautionary tale whispered among slaveholders across the South. A story about how the very qualities that made enslaved people valuable could transform under the right circumstances into weapons that no amount of violence or legal power could fully neutralize. North Carolina in the early 1830s occupied a peculiar position in the political and economic landscape of American slavery, neither as wealthy as the Deep South cotton states, nor as established as the Virginia tobacco aristocracy, existing in an uncomfortable middle ground that shaped its particular form of exploitation. The state's economy depended heavily on tobacco cultivation, though yields had been declining for decades as the soil exhausted itself from generations of intensive farming. This agricultural decline had transformed North Carolina into a major exporter not of crops but of human beings, with an estimated 40,000 enslaved people sold south and west between 1820 and 1840 to feed the insatiable labor demands of the expanding Cotton Kingdom. The domestic slave trade had become one of the state's most profitable enterprises, with professional traders maintaining headquarters in Raleigh, Fayetteville, and other commercial centers, their advertisements in local newspapers offering to purchase likely Negroes for cash, and promising discretion in transactions that even participants sometimes found morally troubling, despite their dependence on the practice. The society that governed these transactions operated under legal structures that defined enslaved people as chattel property, subject to the same laws as livestock or furniture, yet simultaneously required constant vigilance and control that betrayed deep anxiety about the possibility of resistance. North Carolina's slave codes, refined through decades of legislative adjustments, attempted to manage this contradiction through increasingly detailed regulations that criminalized everything from learning to read to gathering in groups without white supervision. The state maintained official slave patrols, groups of armed white men authorized to stop, question, and punish any black person found traveling without proper documentation, creating a surveillance system designed to make unauthorized movement nearly impossible. Free black people existed in this environment under crushing restrictions, required to register with county courts and forbidden from most occupations. Their very presence considered a dangerous challenge to the racial order that justified slavery through claims of inherent black inferiority. Into this world of codified oppression and systematic dehumanization came someone whose physical presence and strategic intelligence would demonstrate that the system contained fatal flaws its architects refused to acknowledge, even when those flaws became impossible to ignore. Stories passed down through generations claim that Ashen arrived at Fairmont Plantation in September 1831, purchased at a Greensboro slave market from a Maryland trader who specialized in moving people from the exhausted tobacco regions of the Upper South to buyers throughout North Carolina and beyond. The coffle that brought Ashen south had included 23 people, men and women of various ages shackled together for the 2-week journey that covered nearly 300 miles of dusty roads and river crossings. But from the moment the trader's wagon pulled into Greensboro's Market Square, Ashen commanded attention that no amount of routine commercial procedure could suppress or normalize. Standing 7 feet and 5 inches tall, with a frame that suggested both extraordinary strength and surprising grace of movement, he literally looked down on the traders and potential buyers who circled him with the appraising eyes of men evaluating livestock. His skin carried a darkness that suggested recent African ancestry, and oral histories indicate that he spoke with an accent that marked him as foreign-born, someone who had endured the Middle Passage rather than being born into American slavery, and its particular forms of psychological control and cultural erasure. The auction itself became something of a spectacle in Greensboro, drawing curious onlookers beyond the usual crowd of planters and traders who attended such events as routine business. The auctioneer, recognizing both commercial opportunity and potential difficulty in selling someone so unusual, emphasized Ashen's extraordinary physical capabilities while carefully managing information about his background that might make buyers nervous. Some accounts indicate that the trader disclosed Ashen had been difficult to manage in Maryland, prone to what was described as sullen disobedience that stopped short of outright defiance but created persistent problems for overseers trying to extract maximum labor. This disclosure should have reduced Ashen's price, as buyers typically avoided purchasing people with reputations for being difficult to control. But his sheer physical impressiveness, the potential labor value represented by that massive frame, overcame prudent hesitations among several competing bidders who saw in Ashen's size the promise of productivity that would justify whatever management challenges might arise. The winning bidder was Thomas Hartwell, a planter who had inherited Fairmont plantation from his father, but had struggled to maintain profitability in the face of declining tobacco prices and soil exhaustion that reduced yields year by year. Hartwell had borrowed heavily to purchase additional enslaved workers, gambling that increased labor would compensate for diminishing land productivity, and Ashen represented the culmination of this strategy, one worker who might do the work of 2 or 3 normal men, justifying a purchase price that exceeded $1,500 at a time when prime field hands typically sold for $800 to $1,000. Local tradition holds that Hartwell made this purchase against the advice of his overseer, a man named Drummond who had decades of experience managing enslaved workers, and who warned that anyone described as having management problems would likely cause more trouble than their labor was worth. But Hartwell, desperate to reverse his plantation's declining fortunes and convinced that proper application of discipline could break anyone's spirit, overruled these concerns and completed the transaction with confidence that would prove tragically misplaced. Hartwell purchased Ashen with specific intentions that revealed the planter's particular anxieties about his own declining status among North Carolina's slaveholding elite. Beyond the obvious labor value, Hartwell wanted a visible symbol of his continued wealth and power, proof that he could still afford to make substantial purchases when many of his peers were selling off assets to meet debts. He planned to use Ashen for the heaviest work clearing new ground for cultivation, but also intended to display him to visitors as evidence of Fairmont's continued prosperity. What Hartwell failed to anticipate? What his desperation prevented him from recognizing was that he had purchased someone whose every quality would expose the contradictions and vulnerabilities at slavery's foundation. Someone who possessed both the physical presence to command involuntary respect and the intelligence to recognize and exploit every weakness in the system designed to control him. The rhythm of life at Fairmont Plantation followed patterns established through generations of tobacco cultivation, a cycle of intense labor punctuated by periods of relative quiet that differed markedly from the year-round demands of cotton production in the Deep South. The growing season required careful attention to tobacco plants from early spring through late fall, with workers performing the delicate task of removing suckers and monitoring for pests that could devastate an entire crop. Harvest brought weeks of brutal labor cutting and hanging tobacco in curing barns, where heat and humidity combined to create nearly unbearable working conditions. Winter offered some respite from field labor, but brought its own challenges as enslaved people were assigned to clearing land, repairing equipment, and performing maintenance tasks that Hartwell's chronic financial problems had deferred during more profitable years. Throughout all seasons, discipline was maintained through Drummond's systematic application of violence, the overseer believing that regular punishment prevented resistance more effectively than waiting to respond to actual infractions. Ashen worked in these fields and forests like everyone else, initially assigned to a gang-clearing new ground where his height and strength made him devastatingly effective at removing trees and breaking soil too root-bound for normal plowing. But scattered documents hint that from his earliest days at Fairmont, his presence created complications that neither Hartwell nor Drummond had anticipated or knew how to manage. His extraordinary height made him visible from anywhere on the plantation, a landmark that couldn't be ignored or overlooked even when overseers might prefer to focus attention elsewhere. When Drummond looked across the fields to monitor workers, Ashen's head and shoulders stood above everyone else like a beacon, drawing the eye involuntarily and creating a focal point that other workers began using for their own purposes. Oral histories claim that people started coordinating their movements in relation to Ashen's position, developing informal communication systems that operated beneath the overseer's awareness, using the giant's visibility as a kind of semaphore that conveyed information about where supervision was concentrated at any given moment. What Hartwell failed to recognize, what his financial desperation and social anxieties prevented him from understanding, was that he had purchased someone who combined physical extraordinariness with strategic intelligence in ways that made traditional control mechanisms ineffective. Ashen's size should have made him easier to monitor and control, but instead it created a kind of protective visibility. Drummond hesitated to apply his usual brutal punishments to someone so physically imposing, uncertain whether violence that worked on normal-sized people would have the desired effect on a 7.5-foot giant. This hesitation, barely conscious but nonetheless real, created a small space of relative safety around Ashen that other workers noticed and began to exploit. When Drummond approached Ashen to assign tasks or issue corrections, other workers would position themselves nearby, using the giant's presence as a kind of shield that reduced the overseer's willingness to engage in the casual violence that normally characterized his supervision. Some accounts indicate that Hartwell initially took pride in his purchase despite growing evidence that Ashen was creating management problems, bringing him to the main house to demonstrate his height and strength to visiting planters and merchants from Greensboro. These displays followed a familiar pattern. Hartwell would have Ashen lift impossibly heavy objects or reach heights that normal men required ladders to access, treating him like a trained animal performing tricks for the entertainment of guests who measured their own status partly by the exotic nature of their human property. But local tradition holds that these exhibitions began to generate exactly the kind of attention that slaveholders should have recognized as dangerous, creating conversations about Ashen that spread far beyond Fairmont Plantation and took on lives of their own in the telling and retelling. Enslaved people on neighboring plantations heard about the giant at Hartwell's place, developing legends and stories that attributed to Ashen qualities of resistance and dignity that existed as much in the needs of those telling the stories as in any objective reality. Free Black people in Greensboro, the small population that somehow maintained precarious existence despite North Carolina's hostile legal environment, began speaking of Ashen as proof that enslaved people possessed capabilities and potential that slavery's ideology denied. The spring of 1832 brought Hartwell's first serious recognition that his purchase might have been a catastrophic mistake rather than the solution to his financial and social anxieties. Tobacco planting season required intensive synchronized labor, with workers moving through fields in coordinated patterns that Drummond had refined over years of managing Fairmont's operations. But the established patterns broke down when Ashen was involved, his extraordinary height and reach allowing him to work at speeds that made normal-sized workers look slow by comparison, creating resentment and disruption that the overseer struggled to manage. Drummond attempted to use Ashen as a pace setter, placing him at the front of work gangs and demanding that others match his output. But this strategy backfired spectacularly as workers began deliberately slowing down in protest against impossible expectations. Whispered tales speak of Ashen recognizing exactly what was happening and subtly encouraging this resistance, working with exaggerated speed that made the quotas seem even more unrealistic, turning Drummond's management strategy against itself in ways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the plantation's social dynamics. Fragmentary records suggest that by summer of 1832, Hartwell had begun experiencing serious financial pressure that his acquisition of Ashen had exacerbated rather than relieved. The planter had borrowed money to make the purchase, expecting that increased productivity would generate revenues to service the debt, but instead found himself managing constant disruptions and inefficiencies that reduced overall plantation output below previous levels. His creditors began making pointed inquiries about his ability to meet payment schedules, and other planters started questioning his judgment in purchasing someone who was clearly creating more problems than value. Drummond reported increasing difficulty maintaining discipline, claiming that Ashen's presence somehow encouraged defiance among workers who had previously been manageable through traditional applications of violence and threat. The overseer recommended selling Ashen immediately, even at a substantial loss, arguing that removing him would restore order and allow normal management practices to resume their effectiveness. But Hartwell couldn't bring himself to admit the mistake publicly, couldn't face the social consequences of acknowledging that his much-discussed purchase had failed so completely. Instead, oral histories claim he made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he had created. Rather than selling Ashen, Hartwell decided to break him through systematic brutality that would serve both as punishment and as public demonstration of the planter's absolute power over even the most physically imposing enslaved person. He ordered Drummond to implement a regime of punishments designed to destroy Ashen's spirit, while stopping just short of damaging him so badly that his labor value would be permanently reduced. The overseer, perhaps relieved to finally receive authorization for the violence he preferred, began a campaign of calculated cruelty that included regular whippings, deliberate humiliation, and psychological torture aimed at reducing Ashen to the broken subservience that Hartwell needed to see to feel his authority was intact. What neither Hartwell nor Drummond anticipated was that their violence would have effects opposite to those intended, transforming Ashen from a management problem into something approaching a symbol of resistance that inspired others far beyond Fairmont's boundaries. Local tradition holds that Ashen endured the punishments with a stoicism that seemed almost supernatural, accepting brutal whippings without screaming or begging for mercy, standing silent and apparently unmoved even as leather cut deep into his back and blood ran down his legs. This response frustrated the entire purpose of public punishment, which relied on the victim's visible suffering to terrorize witnesses into submission. Instead of being frightened into better obedience, other workers at Fairmont began looking at Ashen with something approaching awe, seeing in his silent endurance proof that the master's violence had limits, that they could hurt bodies but not necessarily destroy the will and dignity that inhabited them. Stories about Ashen's resistance through endurance spread to neighboring plantations, carried by workers who encountered each other at market or on roads, creating legends that attributed to him almost mythical qualities of strength and resilience. By the fall of 1832, scattered documents hint that Hartwell's situation had deteriorated to crisis levels that threatened not just his financial position, but his entire social standing among North Carolina's slaveholding class. Fairmont's productivity had declined dramatically, partly due to continued soil exhaustion, but significantly because of the persistent disruptions and inefficiencies that seemed to center on Ashen's presence. Workers who had previously been manageable became increasingly difficult to control, engaging in small acts of resistance and defiance that cumulatively reduced output, while individually remaining too minor to justify dramatic punishments. Drummond reported that his authority had been undermined to the point where even his most violent responses failed to generate the fear that normally governed plantation operations. Other planters began openly questioning Hartwell's competence, suggesting that his inability to control one enslaved person, even an unusually large one, indicated weakness that disqualified him from respect among men who measured their worth, partly by their capacity to dominate those they claimed to own. Oral histories speak of a confrontation that occurred in October 1832, an incident that would become legendary among enslaved people throughout the Piedmont region, even as planters worked to suppress public knowledge of what had happened. According to these accounts, Drummond attempted to punish Ashen for some minor infraction, ordering him to submit to whipping in front of assembled workers as he had done multiple times before. But on this occasion, Ashen refused with a quiet dignity that was more devastating than violent resistance would have been. He didn't fight or flee or make threats. He simply stood his ground and said, in words that were repeated and remembered across generations, "You can kill me, but you will never make me less than a man." The statement, delivered in a calm voice by someone standing 7.5 feet tall and looking down at the overseer with undisguised contempt, created a moment of absolute crisis in the plantation's power dynamics. Drummond faced an impossible choice. Backing down would destroy his authority completely, but attempting to physically force Ashen's compliance might result in violence that could injure or kill the overseer himself, given the giant's obvious physical superiority. Local tradition holds that Drummond chose to escalate, calling in several other white men from neighboring plantations to help subdue Ashen through overwhelming numbers. What followed was described in whispered accounts as less a punishment than a battle, with multiple grown men struggling to control someone whose size and strength made him nearly impossible to force into submission. They eventually succeeded through sheer numbers and the threat of lethal violence, beating Ashen severely enough to leave him barely conscious and unable to work for more than a week. But the victory was hollow, and everyone present knew it. The overseer had required help from outsiders to manage a situation that should have been routine, and even then had only achieved compliance through near murderous violence that risked destroying valuable property. Worse, from Hartwell's perspective, the incident couldn't be kept quiet. Too many people had witnessed it, and stories spread rapidly through enslaved communities and even among white populations who heard different versions, but all understood that Fairmont Plantation had experienced a crisis of control that exposed uncomfortable truths about the limits of slaveholder power. The consequences of that October confrontation cascaded through the following months in ways that vindicated Drummond's original warning about avoiding difficult purchases, regardless of their potential labor value. Hartwell found himself facing social ostracism from other planters who blamed him for creating a dangerous precedent by failing to control Ashen from the beginning, for allowing the situation to deteriorate to the point where it threatened the broader system's stability. His financial position became untenable as creditors, nervous about his judgment and management capabilities, began demanding immediate repayment rather than allowing him to roll over debts as had been standard practice. The plantation's productivity continued declining as workers, inspired by Ashen's resistance, engaged in increasingly bold forms of defiance that Drummond's escalating violence failed to suppress. Some accounts indicate that enslaved people began deliberately sabotaging equipment and slowing work in ways that were difficult to prove but impossible to ignore, creating chronic inefficiencies that ate away at whatever profit margins Fairmont might have generated under better circumstances. Fragmentary records from early 1833 suggest that Hartwell, facing imminent bankruptcy and complete loss of social standing, made a final desperate decision that revealed just how completely his purchase of Ashen had backfired. Rather than continuing to struggle with a situation that was destroying him financially and socially, he sold Ashen to a slave trader for less than half what he had paid 18 months earlier, taking a catastrophic financial loss but removing the immediate source of his problems. The trader, recognizing that Ashen's reputation for being difficult to manage would reduce his value in most markets, apparently sold him south toward the Deep South cotton regions, where planters cared less about workers' attitudes and more about their capacity for brutal labor, under the assumption that anyone could be controlled through sufficient violence. What happened to Ashen after this sale remains lost to historical record, swallowed by the deliberate gaps and silences that characterize documentation of enslaved people's lives and experiences. Some oral histories claim he eventually escaped to freedom, while others suggest he died in the harsh conditions of a Deep South cotton plantation, where life expectancy for field workers was measured in years rather than decades. What is documented is the complete collapse of Hartwell's position following Ashen's sale. Unable to meet his financial obligations even after liquidating his most valuable asset, the planter was forced to sell Fairmont Plantation itself in 1833, accepting a price far below the property's theoretical value because buyers knew he was desperate and negotiated accordingly. Hartwell left North Carolina for parts unknown, becoming a cautionary tale among slaveholders about the dangers of purchasing enslaved people who had reputations for being difficult regardless of their potential productivity. Drummond found himself unemployable among respectable planters who viewed his failure to control Ashen as evidence of incompetence, eventually leaving the region to find work in the new territories where questions about backgrounds went largely unasked. Fairmont Plantation changed hands twice in the 1830s, with each successive owner struggling to restore productivity that never recovered to levels achieved before Ashen's arrival, as if his presence had somehow fundamentally altered the property's character in ways that persisted long after his physical departure. The story of Ashen survived in oral traditions maintained by enslaved communities throughout North Carolina and beyond, preserved in careful retellings that kept memory alive even when official documents worked to erase any record of resistance or defiance. These stories served multiple purposes for communities living under systematic oppression. They provided proof that resistance was possible even against overwhelming power. They offered examples of dignity maintained despite brutal attempts to destroy it. They reminded people that slaveholders were not invincible, regardless of what laws and social structures claimed. In some versions of the story, Ashen became a figure who helped others escape, or who returned secretly to North Carolina to assist resistance networks. In others, he was remembered primarily for his quiet defiance and his demonstration that physical size combined with strategic intelligence could challenge even the most comprehensive systems of control. The details varied with each telling, elaborated and adjusted to meet the needs of different audiences and circumstances, but certain core elements remained consistent. His extraordinary height, his refusal to be broken by violence, his role in exposing the vulnerabilities that slavery's architects preferred to keep hidden. The deeper truth that Ashen's story illuminates extends far beyond the specific circumstances of one man's experience at Fairmont Plantation between 1831 and 1833. His story reveals the fundamental contradictions that made slavery inherently unstable, despite the massive apparatus of legal power and systematic violence deployed to maintain it. The system required enslaved people to possess sufficient intelligence and capability to perform complex agricultural labor, to manage tools and animals and crops in ways that generated profit for their owners. But that very intelligence, once developed, could never be fully contained or directed solely toward purposes the masters approved. It observed weaknesses, recognized patterns, developed strategies for resistance that operated beneath overseers' awareness, or exploited the system's own rules and assumptions against itself. Enslaved people needed to be visible enough to be supervised and controlled, but too much visibility, especially the kind of involuntary visibility that Ashen's extraordinary height created, could reveal their humanity in ways that threatened the entire ideological justification for treating them as property. Ashen's experience demonstrated that physical size, rather than being simply an asset that increased labor value, could become a liability for slaveholders by making the enslaved person too visible to ignore or reduce to the anonymity that the system preferred. His height meant he couldn't be hidden or overlooked, couldn't be reduced to the interchangeable units of labor that plantation economics assumed. Every time someone saw Ashen, they were forced to recognize his existence as an individual with obvious capabilities and presence that contradicted claims of inherent black inferiority. When Hartwell displayed him to visitors, the planter inadvertently created opportunities for recognition of Ashen's humanity that undermined the dehumanization slavery required. When Drummond attempted to punish him publicly, the overseer discovered that Ashen's size and stoicism transformed the intended demonstration of absolute power into evidence of power's limitations. The very qualities that made Ashen valuable, his strength, his intelligence, his physical presence, became weapons against the system because they could not be fully controlled or suppressed through the mechanisms that worked on people who could be more easily overlooked or rendered invisible in official accounts. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about resistance that official documents systematically excluded or minimized. Knowledge about how enslaved people maintained dignity and agency, even under the most comprehensive attempts to destroy both. These oral traditions tell us that communities developed sophisticated understandings of power and its vulnerabilities, that they recognized the difference between absolute control and the appearance of control that slaveholders needed to maintain for psychological and social reasons. They understood that small acts of defiance, especially when coordinated across multiple people, could create cumulative disruptions that undermined plantation profitability, even when individual acts were too minor to justify dramatic responses. They recognized that enduring punishment without breaking could be its own form of resistance, denying overseers the psychological satisfaction that made violence sustainable as a management tool. And they preserved stories of individuals like Ashen who embodied these principles, who demonstrated through their own experiences that the master's power was never as absolute as laws and social structures claimed. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Ashen's story with the kind of documentary evidence that would satisfy rigorous historical standards does not diminish its essential truth or importance. The story carries the weight of lived experience, of communities that understood the dangers and possibilities inherent in different forms of resistance, that knew which truths could be safely recorded and which had to be preserved in oral traditions that operated outside official channels. It speaks to the creative intelligence that enslaved people brought to the fundamental problem of maintaining humanity in systems designed to destroy it, to the countless ways they found to resist even when direct confrontation meant death or worse. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story about how power works to preserve its own narratives while erasing or minimizing evidence of its failures and limitations. Slaveholders kept meticulous records of property transactions and agricultural production, but rarely documented moments when their authority was successfully challenged, or when enslaved people demonstrated capabilities that contradicted the racist ideology justifying their enslavement. The legacy of Ashen and others like him resonates across American history because it reminds us that slavery was always contested terrain, always resisted in countless ways, both large and small, by people who refused to accept the status it tried to impose on them. Every attempt to maximize control created new vulnerabilities. Every effort to extract more profit generated new forms of resistance. Every assertion of absolute power revealed its own limitations to those paying attention. The enslaved people of North Carolina and throughout the South maintained networks of communication and mutual support that operated beneath slaveholders' awareness, preserved histories and memories that contradicted official narratives, created meaning and dignity in spaces that the system tried to render meaningless and degrading. They understood that freedom might not be achievable in their lifetimes, but that fighting for it, even in small ways, even through quiet defiance rather than dramatic rebellion, was essential to maintaining their humanity and to creating possibilities for future generations. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that fight for dignity and humanity stood 7 feet 5 inches tall, impossible to hide or ignore, a living challenge to every assumption that slavery required its supporters to believe. Ashen's presence at Fairmont Plantation lasted barely 18 months, but his impact rippled outward through networks of communication and shared memory, creating stories that inspired others across generations to recognize that resistance was possible, that slaveholders' power was never as complete as they claimed, that human dignity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how people maintained their humanity in the face of comprehensive dehumanization, about how they found ways to resist, even when the law and social structures arrayed overwhelming force against them, about how they kept alive the dream of freedom even when its achievement seemed impossibly distant.